Hi there, I'm Brother Merrill, and this is Sunshine for the Soul Inspirational Stories. For summer, I've decided to go to a once a week format on my recordings. The one I'm sharing today has some real twists and turns. In 1846, the saints had congregated in Counsel Bluffs. They'd been driven from their homes in Missouri and in Nauvoo. They were on Indian territory. As they waited in Counsel Bluffs and tried to gather themselves and to prepare to cross the plains with their families, President Buchanan decided to test their loyalty to the United States and called for 500 LDS men to join the army. At the time, there was a secret society in President Buchanan's cabinet. They were Southern influenced individuals. Many of them became generals in the Confederate Army, and they were trying to displace the federal forces from the East Coast and thought the best way to do that was with a war. And so the Mexican-American War had started. The Saints were able to get approximately 550 men to join the U.S. Army. It's the only time in the history of the United States that a military unit has had a religious designation. And so Brigham Young negotiated with the feds that they would receive $42 per man before they started. And this money was largely donated to the church. The men in the battalion were allowed to wear civilian clothing. They began their march. It became the longest march in military history. They marched over 2,000 miles. By the time they got to Santa Fe, they'd had to cut to half rations, and many of the men were sick. Approximately a fourth of their numbers had to be left in Santa Fe. They continued to march. At this point, they were destitute. They were on quarter rations. Some of the men went 100 miles without water in the southwest desert. Most of the men's clothes were rags. A lot of them just had a loincloth tied around their middle. But they marched on, they got to San Diego, and they were told that the Mexican-American War was over. To be mustered out of the service, they had to walk to Los Angeles. So they continued their march. When they got to Los Angeles, they were penniless. They had given their wages to their families while they were on the march. Many of them had no shoes and very little clothing, so they had to work for supplies. A group of 40 of the battalioners made their way to San Francisco, and while they were there, they were hired by a man who had a fort over at the foot of the Sierra Nevadas, and he hired them to build a mill. And so they went and began construction and excavation for this mill. And an event took place. It changed the United States completely. And the first written entry concerning this was from my wife's great-great-grandfather, Henry Bigler. Henry recorded in his journal, "Some kind of metal was found which looks like gold, and the news of this spread across the country like wildfire. And soon people from all over the country were trying to get to Sacramento to mine the gold fields." Word came from Salt Lake that the battalioners that were there should go ahead and mine, and the claim did very well for a short time, and then it was just back-breaking work. And Henry records this: "I dreamed I was not going to the mines, but I was on my way to the Pacific Islands, on a mission to preach the gospel in the Sandwich Islands." And shortly afterwards, Charles Colson Rich, an apostle for the church, arrived in Sacramento, and he called 10 missionaries to go to the Sandwich Islands. They traveled back to San Francisco, and on November 22nd, 1850, the 10 elders sailed. They had to bring their own bedding, and they said the food was terrible if there was food at all. So I doubt they had lobster night like they did on Holland America and the Royal Caribbean cruises that I've taken in that same journey. But they arrived, and they began to try to settle in. Having secured adequate lodging in Honolulu, the missionaries climbed an unspecified, convenient mountain where they constructed a crude stone altar, sang hymns, and dedicated the Sandwich Islands for the preaching of the Latter-day Saint gospel. Of the event, George Q. Cannon, one of Bigler's companions, said, "Having thus dedicated the land and ourselves to the Lord, one of the elders spoke in tongues and uttered many comforting promises, and another interpreted. The Spirit of the Lord rested powerfully upon us, and we were filled with exceeding great joy." James Keeler, George Q. Cannon, and Henry Bigler were called to serve on the island of Maui. And Lahaina is a west-facing port, and it was quite often filled with as many as 50 ships that were mostly whalers. When they finally secured a place to stay, Henry Bigler said that it looked like a well-built haystack, not a house. On December 22nd, 10 days after their arrival, they arranged for the Bethel Chapel in Lahaina and preached their first sermon. Since Henry Bigler was the oldest, he was selected to give the sermon. Now keep in mind, these were sailors and whalers that had been on the seas for sometimes a couple of years. So when they got to land, the last thing on their mind was religion. They were thinking of booze and women more than they were God. And so they had very little success. Of that situation, this is what they wrote. "It was true that we had not been particularly told to preach the natives of these lands," Elder Cannon observed, "but we were in their midst, and had full authority to declare unto them the message of salvation. Furthermore, it had proved a hopeless labor, trying to convert the white population." So at that point, they decided that they would try to teach the natives. They had already run into the barrier of native food and found it very distasteful and hard to stomach, but the native language was a step above in a challenge. They really struggled and dedicated themselves faithfully to try to learn the language as much as they could. George Q. Cannon wrote the following about an experience that happened to him. "My desire to learn to speak was very strong. It was present with me night and day. I never permitted an opportunity of talking with the natives to pass without improving it. I also tried to exercise faith before the Lord to obtain the gift of talking and understanding their language. One evening, while sitting on the mats conversing with some neighbors who had dropped in, I felt an uncommonly great desire to understand what they said. All at once I felt a peculiar sensation in my ears. I jumped to my feet, and with my hands at the sides of my head, I exclaimed to Elder Bigler and Elder Keeler, who were sitting at the table, that I believed I had received the gift of interpretation of tongues. And so it was so. From that time forward, I had but little, if any, difficulty in understanding what the people said." In fact, George Q. Cannon went on to translate the Book of Mormon into the Hawaiian tongue later in his life. Some of the elders were not as fortunate. Half of the missionaries, 5 of them, left, including the mission president. He decided that maybe they'd have better luck in the Marquesas Islands, and so he left. So 5 elders were left alone in the Sandwich Islands for 2 years. And during that time, they wrote back to Salt Lake and asked if they could get some help from some other missionaries. These missionaries really struggled because the natives were poor, and this describes the situation. "One incident I will relate, which occurred a few months after we went to Wailuku, to show how the Lord hears and answers prayers. We were very much in need of some means to supply stuff for garments, etc. The natives were very, very poor, and we felt delicate about asking them for anything. But we knew that the Lord would hear and answer our prayers, so we prayed to him. Brother Hammond had brought his wife and child over from Lahaina. He and I had to make a visit to a town about 12 or 15 miles distance. Before starting, we prayed to the Lord to open the way so that we might obtain what we wanted. We had traveled from the house about 3 miles. When in passing some houses which were on the beach, we met a man by the name of Freeman, an American. He accosted us and inquired if we had the authority to marry. Upon our informing him that we had, he asked if we could spare the time to stop at his house and marry him. We told him, as it was on our way, we would stop. I performed the ceremony at his request and addressed the people who were assembled at the house. He gave us a $5 gold piece. We had married many before, but this was the first money we had ever received for doing it. $5 supplied our necessities, for in those days we were content with very little. In the early spring of 1853, 9 more elders arrived. The 5 missionaries had been able to have some fruits of their labors, and they had converted thousands of people by that time, over 2,000 at that point. And with the conversions began a resistance from the local ministers and churches, an anti-Mormon movement that began to really gain speed and really put pressure on the elders. About that same time, Howley arrived in Honolulu, and when he came into port, he brought smallpox. And soon the pox spread across all the islands. Elder Bigler was called to serve on the island of Oahu with one of the missionaries, and that was the island that was hardest hit by the epidemic. And the natives got to where they were very wary. They didn't even want to talk to a white person because they felt they were probably carriers. The work struggled. They had been there for 3.5 years. In July of 1854, the original elders were released. And Elder Cannon describes their farewell. When we arrived at the wharf, we were greeted by hundreds of saints who had gathered to bid us farewell. These saints had prepared a huge feast in our honor and had planned to have a 2-day farewell meeting. Not only had the saints gathered, but there were also many non-members and government officials, others who had known and learned to love the elders. Elder Cannon continued with these thoughts. I could not eat. All my appetite had left me. The thought of leaving those with whom I had been associated in all circumstances for years on the closest terms of brotherly intimacy deprived me of any relish for food. My feelings were poignant, and the pangs of parting deprived me of all feelings of joy at the prospect that was opening before me of seeing my mountain home with all of its loved ones. As the ship bearing the elders set sail for San Francisco, Elder Cannon watched the islands fade in the distance. Only a few years before, the message of the Restoration had not been on these islands, and now there were upwards of 4,000 members of the church in Hawaii. He could not help but compare the difference between the modest arrival and their glorious send-off. It had been 8 years since Elder Bigler and Elder Cannon and Elder Keeler had seen their families, but they made their way home. They arrived in San Francisco August 12th, 1854, and returned to Salt Lake. Henry Bigler was 40 years old, and he married C.J. Whipple in 1855. They had a daughter a year later, Elizabeth Jane, and he was in Salt Lake the following February in 1857, and he met Brigham Young. And Brigham Young told him to prepare to return back to the Sandwich Islands as mission president, and asked him if he would give him some references as to other people who could go back with him. So in the April conference of 1857, 11 elders were called to go to the Sandwich Islands. But there was a situation taking place that could have changed history. The secret organization in the cabinet of President Buchanan had failed in keeping the army out west with the Mexican-American War, and so they had contrived another situation that's referred to as the Utah War. And this may seem like a detour of the story, but it's important to understand the complex nature of the political scenario that led to this situation. I've had a discussion with many people about paradigm versus truth. Many people believe that if they think something is true, that makes it true. But that's not the case. Truth is truth. Truth is reality. It's eternal. And your viewpoint is a paradigm. It's your view. And yet most of us act on our view and what we conceive things to be rather than on absolute truth. That's one of the real beauties of the gospel, is to have eternal truths in our lives. And at this point, this cabal in the cabinet for President Buchanan had fed him with misinformation. An Indian Affairs officer had come back from Utah and said, the Mormons are conspiring with the Indians and the Mexicans. The Indians won't even listen to me out there. Well, the actual situation was the Indians had learned to trust the LDS people. They even subjected themselves to their court systems and to their leaders because they knew they'd deal honestly with them. They had not had that experience with the federal government or with the federal court system, and so they didn't trust federal authorities. These members of the cabinet convinced the president that it was part of an upcoming revolution where the Mormons were going to build an empire in the West and take the Western United States as an independent country. And then there were the runaway officials. One of the federal appointees that had come out to Utah as the appointed secretary of the territory had brought $20,000 and given it to Brigham Young to conduct a census and an election. And the census was conducted and the election was held and they elected officials to serve, but they had not given the honor of certification to this little Fed. And so he got his hair on fire and he ran back to D.C. It's a complete rebellion. They won't listen to anything. They've just taken the money and several things. And then men came out to Utah. And back then in the West, the morals of many of the men were very loose. And so they came to a big city like Salt Lake and they expected prostitutes to be available. And they said, the Mormons have monopolized all the women. They don't let any Gentiles even come into town. And none of these things were true, but those were all the things that they had been told. And this Southern cabal, this secret organization, Secretary of War J.B. Floyd and others were pushing the president. Approximately 40% of the U.S. troops were mustered to serve in Utah. At the head of this group was a man called Brigadier General William S. Harvey. His nickname was Mad Bear. He'd been court-martialed 5 times for violence between him and other soldiers and insubordination. He'd been civilly prosecuted for beating one of his female slaves to death and acquitted because she was black. So this was a violent man, and he was bringing the army of the United States, and this was no small group. 40% of the U.S. troops is about the same number of troops that were used during the Vietnam conflict in Cambodia, Laos, and all the other countries of Southeast Asia. So proportionally, it was a huge, huge military organization. So Brigham Young called for all hands. He called all the missionaries home from Australia and the Pacific and everywhere else that they were. And he brought them back to Utah to help defend the saints because they believed that the army intended to kill every man, woman, and child who would not submit and denounce the faith. The leaders of the church tried to negotiate. They had several men go back east, not just LDS men. Colonel Kane went back there. He was a friend of the saints, but they would not listen to them. And so Johnson's army was on their way, and they continued to negotiate. And I won't get into the whole war, but it became a magnet for all the dandies and adventurers of the time because they were a little scared of the Indians and battling the Indians out west, but everybody wanted to have part of conquering the West. And shooting these Mormons would be like shooting fish in a barrel, one man said. So all these Gentiles came to Salt Lake, and one of them was a man named James Gibson. He had a colorful past, and I'm probably going to do an episode of my broadcast just about him. So he came into Salt Lake, and he saw an opportunity because he knew missionaries had been in the Sandwich Islands, and he wanted to build what he called Oceanica. And he had imagined this empire in the South Seas. And so he convinced Brigham Young to send him to the Sandwich Islands, and he was called on a mission. And when he got there, it was crazy what he did. He began to enforce tithing. It wasn't voluntary. He took his mission call and he put big gold seals on it and ribbons all over, and he told everybody, I am equal to Brigham Young. And then he began to sell positions. You could become an apostle for $150. And soon he embezzled enough money from the poor native saints. He was able to buy half the island of Lanai. He told the saints that he had to put the title in his name for legal reasons. But soon he was acting like a king, like an emperor, or even like deity. If the natives came into his presence, they were expected to be on their hands and knees. If they came into his home, they had to be on their hands and knees. And 8 of the native elders knew that it wasn't right, and they wrote Salt Lake. Meantime, in Salt Lake, Brigham Young's got this huge army. They've got cannons at Fort Douglas pointing at his home and at Temple Square and the saints down below. And he was trying to work all these things out. But when he found out what was going on, he sent Joseph Fielding Smith and 2 other apostles, E.T. Benson and Lorenzo Snow. Brigham Young one time said that every time we build a temple, the bells of hell ring. I want to hear them ring. And that's the way the work in the Polynesian Islands was. Satan knew that these were wonderful, good people. The missionaries said that the laying on of hands brought about miracles so commonly that it wasn't even worth mentioning. People were raised from the dead. People were healed from smallpox and other terrible diseases and crippled situations and blindness and deafness. But their faith as a people is just wonderful. I've worked in the temple for 27 years, and I was a coordinator for one of the shifts in our temple that was manned by Polynesians. We started off with one ordnance worker, Sonny Makasini, and before the Provo Temple closed, we had over 100 Polynesian ordnance workers. They're great people. But Satan wanted to keep this work from going forward, and so he met them with resistance. The missionaries got to Honolulu okay. As they came to Lanai to try to deal with the situation that was taking place with this Mr. Gibson, they were met by Satan. The captain, who was probably drunk at the time, sat in the little boat, and as they came towards the harbor, it looked like big swells. But as they got closer, they could see that they weren't just little waves. They were 30 to 40 feet tall. And they cautioned the captain. He was just sitting there holding this bag of silver, and he said, no, we're fine. Well, just after they entered the harbor, a big wave caught them and carried them 50 yards in distance. And when it left, they were down between these 2 huge swells, 30 or 40 feet tall. And the next wave caught them, and when it crested, it flipped them upside down. Well, most of the people on board knew how to swim, except Lorenzo Snow. When the boat started to go over, Lorenzo Snow grabbed the edge of the boat and went over with it. All the others dove into the water and then came back. People on shore could see the problems, and they jumped in a boat and came out to him, and they could not find Lorenzo Snow. They loaded everybody into the rescue ship that had come from shore, and then they said, we got to go pick up the captain. And by then, 2 of the natives had gone over, and they'd found him sitting on the bottom holding his bag of silver, and he'd sunk straight to the bottom, and 2 of them had to drag him up. The missionaries protested leaving the overturned ship that they'd been clinging to because Lorenzo Snow was still gone. The natives began to dive and to search, and finally, one of them felt Lorenzo Snow under the boat, and they drug him out of the water, threw him into their little boat, and so they took him and laid him across a barrel, and they rolled him back and forth until they got all the water out of him. After working over him for some time without any indication of returning left, the bystanders said there was nothing more that could be done for him. But we did not feel like giving up on him. we still prayed and worked over him with an assurance that the Lord would hear and answer our prayers. Finally, we were impressed to place our mouth over his and make an effort to inflate his lungs, alternately blowing in and drawing out the air, imitating as far as possible the natural process of breathing. This we did until we succeeded in inflating his lungs. After a little, there was a very faint indication of returning vitality, a slight wink of the eye, which until then had been open and deathlike, a very faint rattle in the throat, first the symptoms of returning life. These grew more and more distinct until consciousness was fully restored. When this result was reached, it must have been fully an hour after the capsizing of the boat. So Lorenzo Snow was preserved. He came back to life, later became a president of the church. The missionaries went to shore. They went to Mr. Gibson's house and were appalled at what they found. He had a mesmerizing effect over the white people and the natives of the island. He was subsequently excommunicated, and the work really floundered in the Sandwich Islands for quite some time. But if you've known Polynesian people, they are the blood of Israel. There are half a dozen operating temples on the Polynesian Islands at this point. They are fine people. Satan always tries to resist goodness, and he wants all of us to feel like we're not good. But I want you to know that the Lord loves you, and he loves me. We've all made mistakes. We've all done things that are wrong. But despite anything we've done, the Lord loves us, and he wants to guide us, not just for goodness of the world, but for our own lives for goodness. So if you feel you're lacking direction in your life, kneel down and ask the Lord to guide you, and then listen to your thoughts, and you will feel the Lord's guiding hand, and you will know that God is there watching you, watching your lives, and guiding you, because the Lord loves us, and he wants us to be happy. I hope you've enjoyed this story today. I appreciate you watching. If you've enjoyed this story, you'll probably enjoy this one. And if you like these, you'll probably enjoy all Brother Merrill's inspirational stories. Thank you.